So welcome to this lunchtime session. Fracking and Fukushima has to be read carefully. That fracking and Fukushima are energy security fears. My name's Tony Gilland. I'm the Science and Society Director at the Institute of Ideas. I'm not going to say very much by way of introduction. The issue of energy has been big in the news this year because of the Fukushima issue, the troubles in the Middle East and the Arab Spring and concerns about security of supply. And the question often comes to me in the current period is a sort of a sense of inevitability of higher energy prices and greater insecurity over energy supply. And I suppose the question I would quite like to understand as a consequence of this debate perhaps better is to what extent that inevitability is reality, or whether there are things that can be done about it. And certainly one of the things that has caught my eye over this past year has been the increasing interest in unconventional oil and gas, and the announcement recently of a find in Lancashire around Blackpool of a substantial amount of gas that could become available through the process now known as fracking. So I'm sure that will come up during the discussion. To introduce very briefly our speakers so that they can then get on and make their comments. First to speak on my right will be Professor James Woudhuysen. He's Professor of Forecasting and Innovation at Montfort University. He's co-author of Energise, A Future for Energy Innovation, excuse me. And he's also co-author of Big Potatoes. So welcome to James. Next to speak, very pleased to have on my left here Tanya Morrison, who is the International Government Relations Manager with a focus on climate change issues at Shell, who very kindly have supported the Battle of Ideas as one of our headline sponsors, and delighted to have Tanya and obviously Shell's involvement. She leads advocacy with the UNFCCC, which stands for the United Nations
Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Perfect, thank you. I knew you'd do it better than I would. Along with a range of other international bodies. And she recently led on CO2 advocacy in the UK as well. So welcome to Tanya. And then finally, very pleased to have Professor Gordon MacKerron, who is the director of SPRU, the Science and Technology Policy Research Unit at Sussex University. And he's been director there since December 2008. And previously was the director of the energy group within SPRU since 2005. And basically, Gordon is a very well-established economist specialising in energy and environmental issues, and has been an advisor to a wide variety of House of Commons select committees. So welcome to Gordon. Okay, without further ado, let's hear what the speakers have to say before we stir up the debate and invite your comments and contributions. James, please.
Whenever I hear the word security, I reach for the safety catch of my Browning. That's a paraphrase of a famous Nazi statement, usually attributed wrongly to Goering and Goebbels about the word culture. But I think for us with any historical background, any familiarity with the Cold War will tell us that when you hear about security, and even today in normal life, when you hear about the security of your home and all of these things, it's a way of whipping up fears that are often exaggerated. In fact, it was Bob Dylan who pointed out that everybody was crouching under school desks throughout the 50s for fear of a nuclear attack. I think why we're talking about energy security today is if you look at the popular support for the Falklands War, much, much greater than the popular support for the Libyan War. Quite hard for elites today to cohere popular sentiment around the whole idea of security in the conventional sense of national security and defense. But it's much easier to convince people that the lights may go off at any moment, and this is something that very much in their interest to stop, and that's why they should economize on their energy, not drive so much, not fly so much, and generally do their bit for the energy scenario in Britain for the next 10 years so that we can keep everything running. I think with the way in which climate change has kind of come off the boil a little bit in the last 2 or 3 years, in order to make the argument for renewables and for behavior change, the Greens have moved from apocalyptic scenarios about climate change going to flood Westminster at any moment to a more nationalistic, insofar as nationalism works today, scenario where they say it's very important that we build wind power because we don't want to be reliant on Middle Eastern oil, we don't want to be reliant on Russian gas, although at the moment we import very little of it, but there will be rising imports of gas generally, from 30% to 70% will be imported by 2020, and raising that kind of dependence in international energy, they suggest that we should be more autarkic, that we can only assure our energy security by building more wind turbines and by looking at renewables generally. I might add, this is not just a green perspective. Our own mayor in London, Boris Johnson, as he's known, has suggested that we are running out of oil, we're running out of gas, therefore we must have a whole number of very silly micro renewables projects in London to make sure that London can keep running. So if you look at the way in which the issue has come up, it's by no means reassuring that we should take security seriously when it's broadly just moving the goalposts for Greens and for government away from climate change a little bit, although there's still a lot of paranoia about that, toward the whole idea that we've got to provide for ourselves because we can't trust anybody else to help us. This is all the more remarkable because just the other day, the House of Commons Select Committee on Energy pointed out that British gas storage allows for just 14 days of the country running on gas, whereas in Germany and France it's more like 60 or 80. So I would say that insofar as we face problems with energy, they are problems of bad planning, bad storage, bad forecasting, and a general attention to energy demand rather than energy supply. If we got the storage right, if we'd spent money on the national grid like we should have and hadn't built up a bill that will be amounting to £200 million over the next few years, then we wouldn't be discussing security. We would just be talking about how we can add to an already full supply. But that's not the debate that we're in. And it's interesting that even relatively positive things on the horizon, like what Tony referred to, shale gas and so on, are already stigmatized as dangerous as Fukushima, as dangerous as Deepwater Horizon. I'm told if you go to the Finsbury Square, Occupy Wall Street, somewhat geographically strange. If you go to the Finsbury Square tents, they have a whole seminar coming up on why we should oppose fracking in the yurt at Finsbury Square, if you want to attend. And it's all the more remarkable, really, when you look at the figures in Blackpool, where there was a 2.3 Richter scale earthquake on April Fool's Day and 1.5 on the 27th of May because of the drilling done for shale gas by Quadrilla in their Prees Hall drilling site off the coast. These figures, they don't compare with the Japanese earthquake Richter scale figures, but in fact, when you look at 1.5 or 2.3, you'll find that there's 25 naturally occurring earthquakes at the Richter scale 2 each year in Britain. And there's 3 each year happening at the Richter scale 3. So although there's no doubt lots to be still discovered about how best to go drilling for shale gas, nevertheless, what happened in Blackpool is not earth-shattering. It's something that happens in Britain quite often, and it means that although shale gas is completely overestimated by the right wing in the States as a means of becoming free of oil sheikhs and moving to that autarky that I've described, its opponents are equally wrong to suggest that it would be very dangerous to continue in this path. So I think we've got to take very skeptically this whole discussion on energy security. And I might add, the thing that's really coming down the pike is that Britain's energy utilities are completely unprepared for a cyber attack So there's another aspect of energy security, which means that our power stations, our grid, E.ON, EDF, British Gas, are not only indicted for profiteering by that well-known radical Chris Hooner and making too much money out of you poor oppressed consumers, but they're also held up as people unprepared for a Syrian, a Russian, an Al-Qaeda virus like the Israelis put in Iran with Stuxnet. That aspect of energy security is something we're going to hear a lot more of in the next few years. And I think all it means is that the pressure to turn your lights off and worry about your personal behavior is increased because anything else would make us more vulnerable to foreign attack. This is all the sillier because, in fact, we've never been more dependent on international division of labor in energy. We have liquid natural gas, tankers arriving every day, and more pipelines opening. There's no way we can be autarkic in energy in Britain or anywhere else. If we are worried about the international situation, that's a matter of politics and making alliances with people abroad. It's not a matter of cutting back one's personal use.
Thank you, James. Tanya, please.
Right. Well, I thought it would be useful to start and look back at the energy situation globally. I was interested that James mentioned climate change. When I reviewed the outline for today's talk, I noticed it didn't mention climate change at all. It focused on energy security. And I think a few years ago it would have been the opposite way around. So I think we need to discuss them together in terms of the energy challenge that we face. My interest in climate change is not just because it's in my job description. I've been working in this area or interested in this area for a number of years. I, many years ago, worked at Friends of the Earth, where we had started the discussions there and have moved along. I think some people would be surprised that I'm now at Shell, but to meet the energy challenge, we'll need large-scale investment and large-scale programs, which companies like Shell are able to deliver. So where are we now? The challenge we face, that sounds very echoey, we face in terms of both energy and climate change is unprecedented. I was speaking to a journalist the other day, and he said to me that it's the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced. So what is that challenge? Well, energy demand is growing fast. It might not seem like that in the UK, which is struck down by some recession, but the growth is mainly in the developing world and in the emerging economies. There's been a lot in the papers recently about population. I think tomorrow we will have the 7 billionth person named. The 6 billionth person is just over 12 years old. So within 12 years, we've added 1 billion people to the planet. And all of these people not only need, but they deserve energy. They deserve the energy to have good housing, to have electricity, to be able to go to school, to get jobs, to have all the services that you and I enjoy. They also will want. And there are people on the planet already who do not have access. There's 1.5 or 1.4 billion people who do not have access to electricity. So we need to solve those problems. And the extraordinary increase in demand for energy means that we are going to have a gap by 2050 between energy supply and energy demand, which is about equal to what the energy industry globally was delivering in 2000. So there's a challenge ahead to meet the demand. And at the same time, scientists continue to tell us that we've got a challenge with CO2 emissions, and we need to tackle climate change. And our research shows us that perhaps up to 30% of the world's energy could come from renewables by 2050. But that will require a large amount of sustained effort and investment to reach that goal. And we're here to talk about gas. Gas offers opportunities. It's about, when it's burned in a power station, it's about 50% less CO2 than with a coal-fired power station. And gas is abundant, not least because of the fracking revolution. Shell itself is becoming more of a gas company. We expect soon that we'll be producing more gas than oil. And there are abundant sources. 10 years ago, it all seemed very difficult to get gas out of tight rock. But today, we've turned it around, and the United States, which only 5 or 6 years ago was building LNG import terminals to be able to deal with the gap in supply that it thought it's faced, it now has a surplus of gas and is looking at places to place it. And we think it can be done well. I think there have been a few issues with fracking, but Shell has shared its technologies and its standards and is willing to use them to share with the industry more widely so that we can build up to come to global and international standards. In 1913, Winston Churchill said, "Safety and certainty in oil lie in variety and variety alone." And here, almost 100 years later, we can say safety and security in gas lies in variety and variety alone. So what does that mean? It means our energy security fears can only be allayed by diversity. Diversity in sources of energy, so gas, renewables, nuclear, other fossil fuels, and also in diversity of the sources of gas. I first came into the energy industry or the gas industry in 1997 when I joined the Gas Consumers Council. At that point, the UK was self-sufficient in gas. It now imports. In the time since then, we have built 2 interconnectors, 2 pipelines from Norway, and 3 LNG import terminals. So we can reasonably quickly build the important infrastructure we need, and we can make it so that we've got diverse sources of supplies. There's no need to be dependent on one country. We face an unprecedented energy challenge. Energy demand is growing, and environmental challenges are significant. But there are opportunities. Gas, as the lowest carbon fossil fuel, can help in the transition to a lower carbon economy. Diversity of supply is key to energy security. To do this, we need collaboration and leadership to bring together scientists, urban planners, businesses, and governments and society, by society I mean you, to develop workable solutions. This will not be easy, but at Shell we are optimistic that we will succeed. The human race has faced many big challenges in the past and surmounted them with ingenuity and creativity. We can do so again.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Gordon, please.
Thank you. James may be shocked to hear that I agree with a large part, if not quite all, of what he has said. One area where I think I won't agree with him is that when he says we are paranoid about climate change, you have to remember that people who feel they're paranoid aren't necessarily not being persecuted, and I think a certain degree of healthy paranoia about climate change is warranted. We might come back to that. But where I do agree very strongly, I think I agree with both speakers, is that the issue about security is about our fears, rather than what seems to me a material reality most of the time. The question you really have to ask about fears on security is the old political economy question: who benefits from the fears? Who is going to gain if these fears can be spread widely within society? The debates are quite old. There's an economist called Jevons 150 years ago who spoke about something that we would now call peak coal. He thought that the world's coal resources would be exhausted soon after the year 1900. It wasn't true. He was also worried about energy efficiency, and I'll come back to that at the end. I think there are 3 main kinds of contemporary fears, all of which are exaggerated. The first is that we're running out of resources. The peak oil debate has been exaggerated, though I think there are some real issues about oil over the next 30 to 50 years. But when it comes to gas or to coal or uranium, for that matter, we have absolutely plentiful supplies, and to act now as if we were beginning to run out of gas, coal, or uranium would be, I think, entirely fatuous. It's an argument, of course, and inevitably favored by all advocates of any kind of non-fossil option. Diversity is a basic issue, and Tanya has emphasized it. I won't say much about it. That includes, for the UK, somewhat more gas storage capacity than we currently have, though that's a big and rather technical debate. The second issue where there are big fears are fears of imports. The Energy and Climate Change Select Committee reported in this last week on energy security and was very clear that security and independence equals independence from foreign suppliers is a poor equation and should not be followed. I agree entirely with James on the question. We cannot have energy independence. It's either impossible or it's impossibly expensive. And in any case, those of you who are old enough to remember, in the 1970s and 1980s, the least secure source of energy in the UK was domestic coal. The secure source was actually imports, and that could happen again. It is not the case that imports equals insecurity, domestic supply, the opposite. The third big fear, and this is a very common one, is the notion that we will have not enough infrastructure. And in particular, because we're closing a lot of coal and nuclear power stations in the next few years, there will be some gap. 19,000 megawatts, about a quarter of our current capacity, may close, and that will somehow cause the lights to go out. It is very plain that with gas as the now plentiful energy source and willingness in principle to build combined cycle gas turbine stations on the part of industry, we will quite easily fill the gap. It is extremely unlikely that the lights will go out, and people who try again to make you fear that it goes out probably have some kind of vested interest in alternatives. But the real problem with that is the climate change issue that Tanya has already referred to. We may well lock ourselves into a very high rate of dependence upon gas because of the likelihood that our electricity supply system will be even more dominated by it. And although gas is good relative to coal, we soon won't have that much coal. Gas is still not very good relative to the kinds of ambitions that we have for climate change, which is an 80% cut in absolute terms in our emissions by the year 2050. And if we lock into a lot of gas by the year 2020, and it's perfectly likely that the technical fix, the so-called carbon capture and storage fix, may or may not work, we'll have to see, then that would seriously jeopardize our chances. So I think a certain amount of paranoia is justified in that area. But bear in mind that climate change itself is pretty difficult. Nuclear is politically doubtful. Renewables are very expensive. And coming back finally to Jevons and the so-called Jevons paradox, energy efficiency is very good, but if energy efficiency is very effective, it actually increases your effective income, and you may spend that income on more energy-intensive goods. So although energy efficiency is to be encouraged, it does not automatically lead to lower energy use. You have to have all sorts of other complementary policies if it is. So it's a difficult equation, but I think the thing we need to worry about is what to do about climate change, not particularly what we need to do about energy security.
I just have one question of my own for all three of the speakers, and it relates to the point that you raised, Tanya, about the unprecedented nature of the challenge. And we're in a situation now in the UK where the government's beginning to discuss openly whether the targets signed up to by the previous government on renewable energy are in any way realistic. I think we were discussing before the session, it's 2020, the target for the UK is 30% of energy from renewables, which some people say Blair didn't realise when he signed the deal, it's 15% target on renewables, which means because that has to primarily come from electricity, it's a 30% target effective for electricity, which means pretty much you need to have 100% wind power, if you're going to use wind power capacity, to meet that target by 2020. Now, no one said this publicly, but it seems to be increasingly bubbling up. This is absolutely unachievable and ridiculous and would be hugely expensive, and committing yourself to an infrastructure that's at the wrong point in time. So my question is, in this debate, by talking about unprecedented challenges and how difficult it all is and how impossibly challenging and have we got ourselves into a situation where either we make the wrong decisions or politicians don't make any decisions, as for example, in the torturous process of coming to a decision about nuclear power? Have we actually made the discussion more difficult than it needs to be by exaggerating the nature of the problem? So I'll start with Tanya, and then I'll move along, and then I'll come out to the audience.
I'm not really an electricity market expert, but I can give you a few views. I think at Shell we consider that we're on a pathway or a transition to a low-carbon economy. And to do that, you need to do a number of things. One of them is to introduce a carbon tax or a carbon price in the large sectors such as the electricity sector, we'd presume it to be a cap and trade scheme. So that way you come down the curve rather than trying to force in technologies which are not yet fully commercialized. And I think offshore wind is to an extent that, and carbon capture and storage. So the issue is not do we need a lot of renewables, it's how quickly we put them in and what the emphasis we put on trying to deploy large-scale renewables very, very quickly, or do we put more emphasis on research and development in the shorter term, start to deploy, learn, and then we can do further deployment as we come down the learning curve. And I think trying to do it too quickly of one type may make it too expensive. This is where the discussions come in about your electricity bills are all going to go up because to put this in is going to mean that you, the consumers, have to pay for this through the electricity consumers, through your electricity bills that comes in through the renewables obligation, and the new things are going to be doing contracts for differences, etc. And it's a choice. It's a choice of how quickly we do it and how we do our electricity system and what consumers and businesses are willing to pay.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. Gordon.
I don't think we've exaggerated the nature of the problem. I think that the solution to the problem is actually extremely difficult. I would agree with you that we're extremely unlikely to get 33,000 megawatts, which is the official target, of offshore wind by 2020. Bear in mind that is almost a half of the total capacity of the entire electricity system in the UK, and as has also been pointed out, it will only at best operate about 30% of the time. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have some offshore wind, but it is excessive to place so much reliance on it. The problem is that many of the other issues are equally uncertain and possibly expensive. The great hope is carbon capture and storage, where we continue to use fossil fuels largely as before, but we remove the carbon just before or just after combustion and thereby decrease our carbon dioxide emissions. There are some real questions about whether it will work, and underlying all this, there are some big philosophical differences about what people think the good life is. Some people don't like carbon capture and storage because it lets us keep on using fossil fuels, which they think for one reason or another is a bad idea. It's to do with some sort of profligacy or inability to live frugally enough. And it's a very big debate that underlies this issue. I personally think we have to depend, so far as we can, on getting carbon capture and storage right, because when one looks at countries like India and China, in the absence of carbon capture and storage, anything that we do here will be overwhelmed by the increase, especially in coal use in countries like that.
Okay, thanks. Gordon, can I just push you on one point about this sort of philosophical objection to fossil fuels? Should that in any way affect the decisions that we're making, in the sense that we don't have a public debate about the philosophical perspective on fossil fuels? I mean, if you had a public debate, I don't know what the division of opinion would be, but I suspect that many people, they're concerned about climate change, but if there was a solution that allowed you to use fossil fuels, I suspect that many people would say, yeah, that sounds very sensible.
I think they would, yes. I think you're right that the underlying philosophy is largely concealed in much of the debate, and a good deal of the motivation of people who dislike many of the proposed solutions are because they dislike many things about modern technology and certain kinds of directions of change, which is a perfectly legitimate position, but it isn't one that is often exposed.
Legitimate position that seems to have held quite a lot of sway, for example, in relation to the signing of this unachievable target.
Yes, but on the other hand, you also have to balance it against what I think is an overwhelming scientific consensus, and I'm an economist, I can't judge it very well, but I've got no reason to dispute it, that the threat posed by climate change over the next 70 or 80 years especially is a huge one, and one that we should not take at all trivially. And we do need to address the problem of how to avoid the worst excesses of climate change very seriously indeed. And that's quite separate from the philosophy issue.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. James, and then out to the audience.
There's a video you can see on YouTube called Shift Happens, all about how many Chinese graduates in engineering there are. But I think in the West, and especially in Britain, the phrase we should bear in mind is drift happens. I think there's absolutely no decisiveness with Chris Hooner except for avoiding his little driving offence. And, we can't expect them to take the right decisions, or indeed any decisions, I think, of moment. Now, I'm a fan of CCS, but I put it to Gordon, since unanimity is not the thing at the Battle of Ideas, that carbon capture and storage is all right. In fact, it's quite useful, especially in the coal-fired plants that China and India are falling back on more and more. But what we also need to think about is air capture, taking the existing stocks of CO2 that were largely created by the British Industrial Revolution and recycling the carbon there to make new fuels for cars and for planes. At the moment, the commitment for that is largely from Richard Branson to the extent of $25 million, where he's giving prizes for people to convert his planes to take that kind of fuel. And I think that's a strong indication that even in the commercial sector, there is not the commitment to solving problems like climate change, which is a real problem, in an ambitious style. May I add, Tony, if I can, that when Gordon rightly indicts and Tanya as well, the rather ridiculous offshore wind targets that we've been set, I'm sure they would agree that all the grid backup that you need for that, introduces another concept, very British, the stupid grid. We've heard about the smart grid, but the stupid grid is where you have to have all kinds of rubber bands everywhere to compensate for the intermittent, unreliable, expensive, and can you actually get the tugs to build it? Renewable through wind offshore. And I think really what we're hearing about more and more in the smart grid, where the government is decisive, is our old friend smart meters. I don't know if anybody's actually seen a smart meter anywhere, but we've been promised it for about 10 years. And, I think we should start talking about stupid meters. Primarily I'm great that you're raising Jevons, Gordon, because energy efficiency and us watching these meters all day is not going to cut it.
Firstly, about fracking, I might be incorrect, but isn't it incredibly water intensive? I know that at least the Canadian tar sands, I'm not sure how similar they are. Secondly, in pushing for just finding more and more resources and being more and more efficient, aren't we just continuing the pattern which has come under so much criticism of just postponing whatever peak will eventually come? And thirdly, this whole idea of people deserving energy, I think, again, it's just continuing a pattern of that we just need to consume more and more when actually we should be taking a step back and saying, hold on, let's stop looking for as much energy as we can. Let's start looking at ways of doing stuff without the amount of energy that we think we deserve.
I think the guy that's just raised a question there about being able to carry on as we are is a bit misguided. I think we should be going even further. Everything's predicated on the planet being destroyed by human beings, but human beings actually make the planet better than what it is, and it's going to naturally go under anyway. So I think we should be going even further than we do, rather than just sticking to where we are on Earth. Thank you.
I wonder if the panel thinks that nuclear power will recover its image after Fukushima, given that it's a way of large-scale energy production without any CO2. That could it still, in areas where there's low earthquake risk, maybe still have a future?
The biggest challenge for the human race is the overpopulation, and that's got to be reduced. But not since 1812 has Britain been self-sufficient in everything. And we should be moving towards more non-fossil fuel options where possible, some separating energy use into static and mobile. Now, when it comes to static, I object to, as a consumer, to any sort of carbon tax on it. But on the mobile one, is anybody looking at the merchant fleet? Because without merchant shipping, half the world would starve and the other half would freeze. What about a nuclear-powered merchant fleet? Maybe thorium and not uranium-based.
I think with fracking, earthquakes in Blackpool are probably not the big issue, though they did receive a lot of publicity. It's really the hydrogeological considerations, so interference in the water table, and also questions of escaping gas, and then whether we can really afford to actually use these marginal fuels given global warming, and that's the argument against, the big argument I think against tar sands as well.
Geothermal energy was always put forward as a great white hope, and there's an awful lot of heat down below us. Is that likely to form a part of the solution of the future? That said, with all the talk about earthquakes, I'm told they tried at Basel, there were quite a few earthquakes when they did some drilling.
Tanya, would you like to deal with a few of those?
So first of all, fracking. I think it does use water. I'm not sure that it's that water intensive, and I think there are ways of recycling water. I know with the oil sands, or the tar sands, if you'd prefer, you can get quite large numbers, but when we recycle 95 or 95 or even higher, up to 100% is our target of the water. It doesn't mean that you're extracting a lot of the water actually off of the rivers or whatever is nearby. There have been in the United States, I think some of the fracking operations were quite close to the surface, but the vast majority will be quite deep down. This is not a new technique. Fracking, which is just fracturing, rocks to get more oil and gas, has been in use for 60 years. It's new because we're using it a lot more and it's created a lot more supply, but it's not actually a new technique.
Can I just ask you, sorry, before you move off from fracking, because it's a thing that we're just beginning to hear more and more about, and you're saying it's not that new, and et cetera, et cetera. To what extent have people in the industry thought about how, given the philosophical points that Gordon's raised, and that there will be philosophical concerns about using fossil fuels, which are likely to lead to lots more attention being paid to possible downsides and things like that, to what extent have people in the industry thought about how to communicate about fracking and the potential for campaign groups to object to it and the whole thing to become a great big news story?
I think already the campaign groups are working against it or campaigning against it, as they do. I think almost all energy sources get somebody campaigning against it. Wind turbines get campaigns against them, oil refineries, nuclear power, so there's a campaign against everything. At Shell and with the other industry partners, we are increasingly finding ways of going out and communicating about fracking. I downloaded a couple of leaflets from our website. You can go find them as well, which explain fracking better, explain where it's come from, and also outline the commitments that Shell has made. And we are working with industry partners to try to make sure that the industry standards come up. On the issue about the more and more energy and the philosophical one about using fossil fuels, we do think about that, but we are also very aware that using fossil fuels, using our products, is the reason why people are as wealthy as they are in the world. So we have a room full of rich people, because everyone here, compared to the world average, is rich. I think the world average is about 10,000 American a year. So you are all rich, saying, maybe we should cut back. Well, it's easy for us to cut back. People that have nothing or very little do not want to cut back. They want to have the types of services that they can get a hold of. I think 800,000 women a year die because of indoor air pollution, and that's from using traditional biomass sources and not burning them very efficiently. So we need to, balance these things out. But as long as we see that, people want our products, it's very difficult to turn on and say you can't have them, which is also the issue between, more and more, but people who have very little do want more, and I personally believe that they do deserve it. I don't know whether or not the merchant fleet could go nuclear. I think I have seen people discuss it, but whether or not it's possible, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff on geothermal, obviously, in Iceland, and I have seen that there are other places in the world. I think even Japan's looking at it further now. Overpopulation is a very difficult issue, and I'm just reading Prospect magazine about this. The easiest ways to go about tackling it are educating women and giving access to information about family planning. But most of the people that are creating the overpopulation or the increase in population have already been born. It's not an issue about more and more babies. It's about people living longer and longer. Okay. So not sure how to solve that one.
Okay, that might be for another debate, I think. James.
It's interesting that along with security, debates on energy are more and more linked to water usage. But I think there's an easy riposte to this, which is you're never going to hear a discussion on peak water, because we're not running out of water. It's impossible to run out of water. And even friends of the dearth, or enemies of the people, as I like to describe them, sorry about that, Tanya. your past creeps up on you.
Yeah.
You know, they are unable to explain to me how water is leaving the planet every day, because even my level of physics, which was done at Gordon's Sussex, convinces me that it's not leaving it. So the water-intensive aspects of fracking are nothing to worry about. Is there a water problem in the world generally? Yes, it's to do with irrigation, distribution, prices, and all of those things. But we need to get it in perspective. You know, we are not running out of that stuff. Geothermal, I have to declare an interest, because this is what you do on The Guardian every day. Well, I'm not on The Guardian, thank God, but I did do a white paper, it's on my website, for Geothermal Engineering Limited. They are hoping to develop not 1 megawatt like David Cameron's wind turbine above his house, but 300 megawatts of geothermal energy, obscurely in Cornwall and Devon, across the two counties. I think there and also in Scotland there's some possibilities for geothermal, but they're much bigger in the United States. We've got to be realistic. Geothermal is not going to allow energy autarky in Britain, but I think it's very, very much neglected as an energy source, and we ought to be looking at it much more closely. No doubt if we made some progress on it, Greens would find a reason to object, and you know, we can anticipate that. Should the merchant fleet be nuclear powered? Why not? After all, the first nuclear reactors were initially developed for Cold War American submarines to power them. Obviously, the merchant fleet isn't as big in terms of vessel size as some of the American vessels of that period, but it would be a great idea to do that. And I think there are some possibilities with thorium, so I look forward to that. If I may, Tony, I just want to pick Gordon up on healthy paranoia about climate change. I hope people will forgive me using a bit of laptop here, but I looked it up since my O-level Greek didn't quite equip me for this, and paranoia actually means madness. So I've got to ask Gordon, you know, I'm familiar with your rather oblique paraphrasing of Woody Allen, you know, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not getting at you. And I'd rather prefer Gore Vidal's "A man who is not paranoid is not in full possession of the facts." But nevertheless, I suggest to you that healthy paranoia is a contradiction in terms, and we need a sober assessment of climate change. And I would like to remind you that when he was in charge of the strategy unit, the notorious Jeff Mulgan, now in charge of Nesta, favoured organised paranoia by the government on everything. And therefore, any concessions like this, Gordon, will increase the security aspects of the state and control of our lives.
Thank you, James. Gordon.
Well, thank you for correcting me on paranoia. I was trying to provoke you by saying healthy paranoia. I do not advocate madness, but I do advocate, as you put it, sober concern for the issue. So in the end, I'm afraid we can't disagree too much on that. I'd like to say something briefly about the notion of the legitimacy of environmental groups, which are being given a pretty hard time. A good part of a healthy democracy is people who will object to things. It's why we have a parliamentary opposition which objects to almost everything a government does, not because they necessarily are going to do terrible things to us, but we need to have a healthy debate. And on the subject of the 33,000 megawatts of wind, no, it won't be reached, but nevertheless, there are real opportunities to bring costs down, possibly to get some kind of industrial leadership, possibly to sell it to other people. So pursuit of offshore wind does seem to me a sensible idea, even if I agree that 33,000 megawatts was always too much. Two or three of the other questions briefly. I'll ignore some that other people have answered or about which I know nothing. The notion about postponing the peak is a very good idea. I mean, you know, let us postpone the peak if we can. Let us not bring disaster on ourselves prematurely, so I don't think that's a good idea. Nuclear power is an area in which I've specialized for most of my career. The problem with nuclear power is that it is risky for the financial community. The great disaster at 3 Mile Island was not that anybody died, because they didn't, but when the operators fooled around for a while, a $1 billion investment was written off, and there was a big cleanup bill. Well, that's not the kind of thing that attracts private investors who want a reasonably secure return on their money, and you can never be sure that another nuclear accident somewhere in the world might cause a serious political reaction, however irrational the nuclear industry might feel that reaction was, and increase the risk. So we will have some more nuclear power, but I doubt if it's a major part of the solution to anything in particular. Overpopulation, I could say a lot about. It is another debate. I don't believe in it, but we could come back to that another time. The merchant fleet, interesting, yes, submarines were originally powered. They're rather small, compact things, but you'd have to rebuild the entire fleet and kit them out with a very expensive, and to make it safe enough, extremely difficult power unit. It's kind of interesting, but I don't think it will really fly. And geothermal, yes, should be investigated a lot further. It's potentially pretty interesting.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's get another round in.
I wanted to go back to this issue of climate targets. I read a thing a few weeks ago, I may be deluding now, but about how the targets in the Climate Change Act were kind of came about as a result of something of a bidding war prior to the election, or the run-up to the election, whereby everybody had been talking about 60% cuts by 2050, then suddenly the figure of 80% appeared from nowhere, and that was the one that got nodded through, without any sort of sense of whether this was practical, necessary, achievable, or anything else. If we continue to stick to such wildly ambitious targets, won't we end up making some very, very bad decisions as a result of that? In terms of the energy gap, I mean, it would seem to me, I mean, it's the message of James's book is that we pretty much need everything, including the kitchen sink, in terms of closing that energy gap. I mean, the amount of extra energy we're going to need globally is going to be absolutely enormous, and we need to take advantage of every opportunity we can economically find to produce that. There's downsides to almost every technology around, so we need a diversity of supply and innovation around it, and we certainly need as much coal, gas and nuclear as we can possibly get right now. And in terms of the point made at the front about using less, well, the things that we actually use the most energy for are transport, heating and air conditioning. And it's very difficult to do very much in terms of using less unless you want to freeze, bake, or just stay at home all the time.
Just related to that issue, that because we need to grow in this country, we need to grow our economy, wouldn't we be better off, the government be better off, for example, putting the money into policies where you create jobs by creating new innovative technologies, for example, making solar power better, rather than putting in the feed-in tariffs, which are actually against that. So they've signed up to these sort of, politically, they've signed up to these, we need to reduce these targets, blah, 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 by this, and they've put into place, like you were saying, essentially implementing technologies that are not there yet. What they should be doing is putting all of that and working together with companies to sort of bring in better innovation to make these, and just be honest with people and say, we're not there yet, it's going to cost you all a lot of money, and you're not going to be implementing the right technology anyway, because we're not there. What we need to do is invest in universities, together with companies, whatever you get it takes, that way creating jobs, that way people would buy into it, the electorate would buy into it. It's creating growth and jobs that we all want, and eventually we're going to get to better energy supplies, which we all need, because there's going to be a shortfall. It needs selling in that way, rather than just saying, we want to sign up to these because we're all green and fluffy, and you're all going to buy into it because that's the right thing to do.
To what extent is tidal energy being developed in the UK? Technology related to that, and secondly, what are the dangers associated to the disposal of nuclear waste from nuclear power stations? Is that a huge concern when it comes to investing in nuclear energy?
I want to know how the panel thought of other smart solutions, such as smart buildings, and how they'd be effective in sort of reducing energy consumption and mitigating climate change, and also on carbon tax. How initiatives such as the carbon reduction commitment and on a Europe-wide scale, the EU emissions trading scheme, how effective these measures would be for large industry in terms of them reducing their carbon footprint as it would be profitable to do so.
On China, so China always gets a bad press in that it's the biggest consumer of energy, and it's always sort of seen as a bit of a problem, and too much population and use and everything. But isn't China one of the sort of biggest investors in trying to find innovative solutions to the problems of energy? And I read somewhere, I wonder if the panel could comment, that it's one of the biggest investors in solar power now, and R&D around solar power. So, China always seems to get put in the sort of, consumption camp rather than actually coming up with some very interesting, innovative solutions to the problems.
Hello. I just wanted to pick up or develop a point that Gordon made in terms of the barrier to nuclear energy development, because I think you described it as more of a financial problem than a technical problem. And I think that's, in microcosm, characterizes a lot of the discussion about energy. I think it's more of a political issues we have to confront than innovation or technology. Because what you described highlights that within energy development in general, it is of its character long-term investments. And it, with all respect to the good work done by Shell and BP and Exxon and Chevron and so on, many of these longer-term investments are not susceptible to private sector commitment. They do need a commitment from the state for these longer-term 10, 15, 20-year investments which may be required in areas of technology which, I'm sure the panel is more familiar than I am, i.e. the technical solutions are there, it's how you actually implement them. And the problem therefore seems to be not how we develop fracking or nuclear energy or whatever, but is the political barriers where most of the politicians seem to be peddling both the fact that we need to consume less and peddling that we're taking too many risks and peddling in general life a very short-termist perspective. So it's challenging that political, cultural problems seems to be much, much more important for us than confronting necessarily the technical challenges.
Carbon emissions in countries like India and China are increasing exponentially, whereas in countries like Britain, they are not really increasing so much. So do you think it's therefore pointless for Britain to try and change or look for alternative sources of energy when countries like China and India can make a much bigger difference on carbon emissions in the world?
I mean, I suppose an issue I've got is there's a large possible cultural element to this insofar as if we're seeing the problem is consumption, whatever, and basically that is almost a moral problem that's wrong. Should we not actually be more ambitious and actually be aiming to actually make energy shortages, security, whatever you want to call it, eradicated so it's just not an issue forever? And because I think the cultural issue impacts on the people that move into technology, engineering, stuff like this. They're probably more turned on by a big problem to solve rather than almost just being seen as a bunch of fixers that aren't really fixing the problem. They're just pushing the problem off to the later on.
There is an issue about public acceptability of technologies, which is, of course, raised, among other things, by nuclear power, and in democratic systems, cannot be neglected. So the notion that we must have lots of everything does run up against democratic process, which I think has to be respected, and we can't just run roughshod over people's desires and wishes at all possible costs. On the subject of nuclear power and radioactive waste, I spent a lot of my life looking at radioactive waste issues. I don't think there are any major technological problems about radioactive waste, but there are huge political problems because it's widely perceived to be a major disadvantage to be a member of a community that has a long-term radioactive waste management site, especially a permanent deep underground repository. I don't necessarily think it's an unsolvable problem, but even if we solved it, it doesn't overcome the problems I think I raised earlier about nuclear power politically. Maybe I should just finish off with a point about some of these more underlying issues. I raised the deep philosophical question about what is the good life, but there is another very big issue which has also been raised, and that is really about the state and the market, where the market actually means companies. And a lot of the disputes are really about how far the state should intervene further than it currently does. It's currently a rather more popular view than it was a few years ago following the financial crisis. I personally think the state does need to intervene more than it currently does, but it is prone to bad decisions, and we need to do a lot more learning by doing and finding ways of reversing things that are not working, and that's not something we're very good at the moment.
Thank you. Tanya.
A couple people raised China. One thing I often say about China is so large you can prove almost anything that you want from it. Yes, a lot of solar. Their solar industry has done very well out of the feed-in tariffs in Germany. So if you've got, doesn't necessarily mean that if you've got a subsidy in one place that it ends up being your industry that benefits. But the issue is not should the UK do nothing because we know the other countries are going ahead. The issue is whether or not we come to some kind of collective approach to being able to address climate change, because it is a global issue. And even though they have large emissions in China and India because they're very large countries, but on a per person metric. They're quite a bit lower. And going to the 80% issue, my understanding is that we went to 80% because we asked the Committee on Climate Change to do some analysis about what it thought the correct target should be. And the 80% came out of trying to do something equitable across the world. And if you wanted to go look at the paper, it's quite interesting. So how do we get to a point where it's equitable by 2050? And that does imply an 80% cut for the UK. Should we go ahead when others are not? That's a difficult issue about what leadership we provide and how much more quickly we go ahead than others. But I don't think we should sort of give up because other countries are growing. We need to find a way to resolve it collectively.
And did you have any view on the question about political and cultural barriers to the sort of longer-term financial investment in new technologies?
I think the governments have always intervened in the energy business. I think we went through a little bit of a cycle where there was a belief that it wouldn't happen or it shouldn't happen at all, could get left to the markets. It can do so, and it can do so well. I think the problem is that part of the issue is that some large-scale technologies, nuclear is one of them, offshore wind is another, and even carbon capture and storage. To get over the hurdles to investment, to get the learnings, then you will need the government to intervene.
Okay, thank you. James?
Well, I'm all in favour of tidal if British business hadn't been worried about the £200 million worth of planning costs that would run up. We would have the beginnings of the Severn barrage by now. Of course, this would lead to a number of sparrows being killed, which we understand is much more important than keeping the lights on. By the way, all reports on wave energy that put it in the same bracket as tidal are seriously misguided. You know, you have to be a rubber duck for 500 years to generate 1 kilowatt from wave. I'm pleased to hear Gordon saying nuclear waste is not a technical problem. In Energise, we calculated that all the nuclear waste, high level and intermediate, that Britain has generated over the last 50 years could be kept in 27 floors of Canary Wharf. It might be a lovely thing to do to the City of London, but what we were trying to get at was that, you know, if we're saying we can't solve this problem over the next 100 years, then, you know, we might as well go back to the cave. And I hope the Large Hadron Collider, somebody had it as the Large Hydrogen Collider, a bit of a mistake. I hope the collider will give us accelerated radioactive decay in the fullness of time to allow us to deal with that problem. I think China is the world's leader in all energy technologies. It's as simple as that. And I said it, and then Jeffrey Immelt, the head of General Electric, said it a month later. So it must be right. And, you know, they are moving ahead very quickly. I think the most significant issue, if I may, Tony, that was raised is that of carbon taxes. And we might discuss something similar to that, the carbon, you know, the floor for carbon prices and all of this thing. Things have got so bad in Britain, where 10% of MPs have a background in financial services, that the solution to all problems is in terms of prices, taxes, signals, and all of these things. And, you know, it's about time that Chris Hooner and some other people were put through a physics course so that they could actually discuss the real issues in energy instead of the accountancy issues. That's the problem that we face. Too many bean counters and all of that. I just want to end by saying, Gordon, I'm all in favour of allowing Greens the right to be stupid in public. You know, we favour democratic debate. That's what the Battle of Ideas is all about. I think we're long overdue in the offices of Spiked and elsewhere in producing a T-shirt that says Carl Malthusians. But having said that, you know, let them speak.
Okay. Thank you to all our speakers.